Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and another video. Today I'm really excited to be showing you a new eco-friendly watercolour paper from Hahnemuhle. So if using more natural, eco-friendly and sustainable watercolour paper is something you're interested in, then this video might just be for you. Before we get started though, I just want to say that whilst Hahnemuhle were kind enough to send me 2 of their new natural line papers to try out for free, they are not paying me to produce this video, so all thoughts and opinions are my own and will be honest. The 2 papers I was sent are the Agave watercolour paper in an A4 size block, which I'll be testing out today, and a smaller pad of the bamboo paper, which I'm going to save for a future video when I've decided what I can paint on a smaller scale. I'll be putting this Agave paper to the test by first trying out several different watercolour techniques and effects on it, and then demonstrating how I use these techniques together on a larger painting of a succulent. So I hope you enjoy the video. Now, in case you were wondering what agave is, and I apologise if I'm pronouncing it wrong, it is a type of succulent plant native to southern Mexico and southwestern parts of the United States, and it yields a stiff fibre which is used to make a variety of products. It's a fast-growing and resource-saving raw material, making it a great option for environmentally conscious artists. Agave makes up 70% of this cold-pressed natural white paper, the other 30% being cotton rag, and it's also acid-free, non-aging and vegan. Different sizes are available, but most of them come in a block from what I can see, and as yet they are not available on sites like Amazon or Jackson's, but I will put links down below as soon as I find them. So far as price goes, the recommended retail price for this A4 block of 12 sheets is around £10, but obviously that may vary depending on where you get it from and where you live. So with all that said, let's get and test it out. Hahnemuhle says that this paper, with its cold-pressed homogeneous surface texture, is suitable for all kinds of watercolour techniques. So I thought I'd see just how it performs by filling out this little test page before starting on my succulent painting. If you've watched any of my previous videos, you'll know that I love using the wet on wet technique, where you apply wet paint onto wet paper, so I thought I'd try this out first. Painting wet on wet is a great way to get interesting colour bleeds and nice soft paint edges, with the option to mix colours on your paper rather than on your palette. I'm using ultramarine blue and lemon yellow here, as these are 2 of the colours I want to use for my succulent. For the first swatch, I mixed them together on my palette to make a green, and dropped it onto the pre-wet paper. The paint did bleed out, as you can see, but maybe not as much as I'm used to when painting on 100% cotton paper. So I'm thinking that's just the nature of the agave fibres and how they behave with water. On the second swatch, I pre-wet the paper as before, then tried mixing the ultramarine and lemon yellow together on the paper. This also seemed to work fine, although I did notice that the watercolour paint seemed to sit on top of the paper for longer than I was expecting, rather than soaking in, and that's something I'll need to remember and perhaps adjust to when painting my final piece. So I'll talk more about that later. Let's take a look next at a few wet on dry painting techniques, and I'm starting off with just a flat wash, so painting wet paint onto dry paper. Straight away I was really surprised by how smooth the paper was to paint on, especially for one that is cold pressed. Interestingly though, you can still see the texture on the paper, so it's quite different to anything I've painted on before. I found painting the flat wash fine, but struggled a bit on the gradient swatch as the paint almost slipped across the paper. So I don't think it's as forgiving as some other cold press papers I've tried, and again I may have to modify my technique if I want to achieve a gradient or transition between one colour and the next in my final painting. On the next swatch, I tested out using a dry brush, and this worked really well as this made use of the paper texture and would be great for adding texture to landscapes or animal fur. The last swatch here, I'm just going to paint on another flat wash and come back to it when it's dry to see how easy it is to add layers or glazes. Before I moved on to trying different effects, I also dropped in some water to the gradient swatch to see how easy it is to create blooms. Sometimes I like to add these deliberately to my paintings, and we'll come back to that later when the paper's dry. Something else I like to do is to add different effects. So next I tried adding regular table salt. Timing is really important with this technique, as if your paper is too wet or too dry, it won't work. So we'll have to come back to that in a bit as well to see what happens. Applying cling film to wet paper is another really easy and quick way to add in interesting effects to your artwork, so I thought I'd try that today too. You need to wait for the paper to dry before you remove it, so let's move on and see how easy it is to soften edges. For the lifting test, I painted another 2-colour wash and we'll come back to it once it's dry as well. So I'm using a clean damp brush and run it along my paint edge to soften it. And apart from forgetting to take the excess water out of my brush and messing up a bit on this edge, it worked fine. There were just a few more things I wanted to try out, and that was to see how effective it would be to use coloured pencils on top of watercolour once it's dry, how well masking fluid came off this paper, and how smoothly gouache laid down. There's no real reason to try this gouache out here other than I wanted to paint the background to my succulent in gouache and didn't want any nasty surprises. It laid down really smoothly though and dried beautifully matte and opaque. Now whilst that lot is drying, let's go back and try glazing over another layer of watercolour on this swatch here. Hahnemuhle states that this paper is suitable for all types of watercolour techniques, but mentions glazing specifically, and this is another technique I use a lot in my watercolour paintings. So I was really pleased that this paper seemed to live up to the claims, and I'll be seeing just how many layers it can take when I try it on my larger scale painting. Close up we can also see how the salt and cling film worked, and whilst the salt was a bit underwhelming, the cling film was pretty amazing and would be really effective on a seascape. The lifting properties of this paper are also super impressive, with the colours I had on my palette at least, which would make corrections a breeze and adding highlights simple, although results might vary depending on the staining properties of the pigments you're using. I also found coloured pencils laid over the surface of this paper really smoothly, which is great as I sometimes like to use coloured pencils at the end of a watercolour painting to add small details, finishing touches or a bit of extra texture. Using masking fluid however did not work out, as when I tried to remove it, it tore up the paper. It's not a huge problem as I just won't use it, but it's good to find out before applying it to your painting. It might also work out better with a different masking fluid, but for now I'll give it a miss. Armed with some useful information and feeling a bit better prepared for what to expect with this paper, I was keen to get started on my succulent painting, and I'll put a link to the reference photo I used from Pixabay in the description box below. For the first layer I decided to paint wet on wet, applying first lemon yellow to my wet paper and then dropping in some green that I'd pre-mixed using the lemon yellow and ultramarine blue. My idea was to use the lemon yellow as a base to help the succulent look bright and fresh, and have the green mixed together with the lemon yellow to help map out where the darker parts of each leaf were. At first though, I did struggle to get the green and yellow to mix on the surface of the damp paper, as the water and paint weren't really soaking into the paper, and I felt like the paint was almost sliding across the surface. Trying to pick up excess water with my brush just resulted in me lifting up paint that I then had to paint back in, so I realised I needed to adjust my technique. For the next leaf, I tried soaking up any surplus water on my brush first on a paper towel before applying paint to the wet paper, and this did give me more control and a better result. And whilst the paper was damp, I was able to drop in some ultramarine blue to the darker shadow areas on the leaves, being careful not to fiddle with it too much and risk disrupting the paint underneath. On this leaf though, I was able to take advantage of the lifting properties of this paper, as I was easily able to lift paint off the paper where there was a lighter edge to the leaf. And by the time I'd got to finishing this first layer of paint, I was starting to enjoy it more and work with the paper rather than battle against it. I still pre-wet the leaf with clean water first, but used a lot less water on my brush when applying it to the wet paper. I also tried to be more gentle with my brush strokes to avoid lifting paint where I didn't want to. So I found a way that worked for me and the look I wanted to achieve. So that's something to bear in mind if you are thinking of trying this or any new paper out. It might take a little while to get used to, and you may have to adapt your technique slightly to account for variations in the paper compared to what you've used before. But don't rule it out based on your first experience, because I ended up feeling really quite happy with how this was turning out. I let that first layer dry completely before painting the second layer. For this I'm using Winsor & Newton Hooker's Green, which is a lovely transparent green, Winsor Blue or Phthalo Blue, and Winsor & Newton's Quinacridone Magenta. These are both also transparent watercolours. They are also staining colours which I thought would help me add layers without having to worry so much about lifting. I also experimented with more of a dotting or dabbing motion with my brush to apply the darker Hooker's Green onto the pre-wet leaf. This was so I didn't drag the paint and risk lifting up or reactivating my first layer, and it worked quite well, and allowed me to leave areas where the lemon yellow could shine through. Painting on the second layer though didn't seem to present as many challenges as the first, so maybe I needn't have been so cautious. Maybe because the first layer of dried paint provided a less smooth surface and gave subsequent layers something to grip onto, or maybe just because I'd got more of a feel for painting on this paper. But whatever the reason, it seemed to go a lot easier and I loved how bright the colours looked. By the time I got to finishing this layer, I realised that adding layers and glazes was actually quite easy on this paper, as long as I was gentle with my brush and didn't add too much water. And with this in mind, could also easily soften edges without creating unwanted blooms. On this leaf, I switched to painting wet on dry to have more control over where the paint was going, as well as really build up the vibrancy and saturation. I'm also adding in some Winsor Blue to the paper whilst it's still wet, and lifting paint from the edge of the leaf here just using a slightly damp brush. I paint on some Quinacridone Magenta to the very tip of the leaf, and then add a glaze of lemon yellow mixed with a tiny bit of ultramarine blue to the back and side of this leaf to really brighten it up. I carried on in the same way for a third layer, and here I'm mixing up more concentrated Hooker's Green and Winsor Blue to paint the darkest values at the centre of the plant, and I'm painting this onto dry paper. I darken up some of the shadows with this colour too, which helps to add contrast and depth. After one final layer, I was ready to paint the background, and for this I'd wanted to use gouache. And even though the masking tape tore the paper on my test sheet, I decided to try this thin washi tape to get a nice crisp border. It's quite low tack, so I thought I'd risk it. For my gouache, I mixed permanent white with primary red, and added a small amount of sap green just to mute the colour a bit for a nice soft pink. I painted this onto the dry paper and it went on really smoothly, and it was worth the risk with the washi tape as it came off really easily without tearing the paper. At this point I could have left it here and called the painting done, but just to polish it up I pulled out a few of my Prismacolor pencils to add some finishing touches and a bit of texture, and I did get a bit carried away here as I was having so much fun. The surface of this cold press paper is much smoother than other cold press papers I've tried, so adding coloured pencil was really effective. I could create crisp, sharp lines with the tip of my pencil or a more textured look by using it on the side. So despite my initial struggles with this paper, I ended up having a lot of fun. And of course I love the fact that it is eco-friendly and sustainable. It is slightly lighter weight at £135 compared to my usual £140 watercolour paper, but because it's in a block it stayed nice and flat and didn't buckle or pill when I was painting. So here is the finished Succulent. I'm really happy with how it turned out, and I hope this video has given you a few ideas for what watercolour techniques you can use on this paper, as well as some tips on how you can adjust your existing techniques to best effect. Don't forget to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and comment below if you have any further questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!